Hey guys, a bit of a different video from me today. Normally I'm guiding you through painting techniques, colour choices and how to get the most out of your miniatures, but I want to try something a little bit different, and that's diving into the lore of Warhammer 40,000, so please bear with me. The first subject is something I've actually spent quite a few years reading into, piecing together from novels, codex entries and quite frankly an unhealthy amount of speculation. So in this video I want to explore the possibility of loyalist Thousand Sons, or as they're also known, the Blood Ravens. In this video I want to explore the evidence of the Blood Ravens being a successor chapter of the Thousand Sons, and I'm going to break the video down into three parts. Firstly, trivial evidence, details that on their own don't really prove much but do start to build a pattern. Then the more compelling evidence, moments in the lore that feel a bit too deliberate to ignore. And finally we'll look at competing theories and whether they hold up in light of the evidence provided in favour of the Thousand Sons. So let's start with some trivial evidence, the kind of details you could easily dismiss until they start stacking up. Firstly, it's the armour and heraldry. Both the Blood Ravens and the pre-Heresy Thousand Sons have one very obvious thing in common. They wear, or wore, red power armour. Now that alone isn't definitive. Red isn't exactly rare in the Imperium, but it is a striking similarity, especially when you consider the Thousand Sons' fifth fellowship. More on that later. But within the Thousand Sons, there was a well-known cult known as the Corvidae, and their symbol? A raven. More specifically a raven's head, but still, the imagery is very close to the Blood Raven's full raven emblem. It's not identical, but it's close enough to raise some eyebrows. You could argue it's a coincidence, or you could argue it's a deliberate echo of their origins. It's not impossible to imagine a scenario in which elements of the Corvidae cult escaped Prospero and merged their logo into something different to try and hide from the Imperium's retribution. The next thing to consider is their emphasis on psykers. Both legions or chapters are well known for their use of psychic powers. The Blood Ravens are unusual amongst the Space Marine chapters for their sheer number of librarians. They don't just tolerate psykers, they rely on them.
Fear not the psyker.
And that's not typical, but it is very typical of the Thousand Sons. The Thousand Sons were defined by their mastery of psychic power. It was central to their identity, their warfare, and their philosophy. And the Blood Ravens, well, they follow that same pattern. Both forces prioritise knowledge, psychic ability, and the pursuit of understanding over brute force alone. Again, on its own, it's not proof, but it is another piece of the puzzle. The next thing is a shared battle cry. The Blood Ravens are known for the phrase,
"Knowledge is power, hide it well."
Simple, iconic, very on brand. But here's the interesting part. That same sentiment appears within the Thousand Sons. Specifically, it's spoken by Revuel Arvida, a member of the Corvidae cult. And that connection matters, because now we're not just talking about visual similarities or battlefield roles, we're talking about shared philosophy. The idea that knowledge is paramount, that it defines strength. This cultural link, as far as we can tell, this potential mantra that could be a common phrase that surviving Thousand Sons, or soon to be Blood Ravens, still uttered to their new recruits, instilling in them the same discipline their original legion was founded on. Now we move beyond coincidence. This is where the theory starts to feel, well, intentional. In the novel Dawn of War Tempest, the third novel in the Dawn of War series, we get a direct interaction between the Thousand Sons' chief librarian himself, Ahzek Ahriman, and a Blood Ravens librarian named Rama. And Ahriman doesn't treat him like an enemy. He calls him a lost brother, a friend of Ahriman, and son of Ahriman. At one point Ahriman even states, as Rama struggles to recall who he is, "You are Rama, a lost brother of Ahriman." That's not subtle. That's about as close as you're going to get to outright confirmation without stating it directly. Now one might claim that this was Ahriman's way of manipulating Rama, perhaps, but it's also one more piece that when viewed with the rest creates a much clearer picture. And it doesn't stop there. Within the Arcadian librarium, Rama discovers an unusual text, a book with an ancient heraldic crest. Wide black raven's wings flanked a bead of blood, which appeared to be represented by an encrusted ruby. The script was runic, possibly of elder origin. I have seen a copy of this before, Ahriman conceded. I owned one for a long time in my personal librarium. I wonder what its meaning might be for you, Angel of Vidya, as he addressed Rama. As I recall, Ahriman continued, I took my copy off of a seer from Beltan. She seemed to have an unusual fascination for these things. Later on in the exchange, Ahriman states, we are not so different, you and I. We were not always so different. There was a time, long ago, before the change, when the 1,000 sons of Magnus wore the blood-red armour of their Primarch. Ahriman then elaborates further. Do you think that it is coincidence that the librarians of your blood ravens wear the blue armour of my prodigal sons and the rubric of Ahriman? Continuing, Ahriman explains that the writing on the tome translates into the unfounding. As I recall, your Azariah Vidya once held a copy of this book. If I remember correctly, he even wrote a commentary on it. What was it called? The Apocrypta of the Unfounding, replied Rama, one of the foundational texts of the Order Saikana. This implied that Ahriman knew Azariah Vidya, the great father of the Blood Ravens, better than anyone might have expected. This opens up a massive implication, that Ahriman has direct knowledge of the Blood Ravens' origins and possibly knew Vidya well enough to know which books were in his possession. Could Vidya once have studied within the halls of Prospero? Now we get onto something a little darker. The 1,000 Sons were plagued by a mutation known as the Flesh Change, a genetic instability that caused horrific physical transformations. It was one of the defining tragedies of their legion and motivated their entire history, from Magnus's original bargain with the Dark Powers to Ahriman's rubric. Preventing their own mutation has been the 1,000 Sons' raison d'etre. Now, fast forward to the Blood Ravens. At the end of Tempest, the newly recruited scout Creus undergoes standard transformation into a space marine. But something goes wrong. At the end of his surgeries, his hands, well, they're not hands anymore. They're described as fleshy stumps with tendrils forming where his fingers should be. It's subtle, but unmistakably reminiscent of the Flesh Change. And here's the key detail. He isn't executed. Chapter Master Gabriel Angelos doesn't purge him. He orders gauntlets to conceal it. That decision is unusual. It suggests awareness, possibly even familiarity, as if this isn't the first time something like this has happened. Now perhaps Creus's mutation was due to the planet he was recruited from, or exposure to the warp during his surgeries, which is hinted at in the novel. So is there any other way to explain away the Flesh Change, something that all 1,000 Sons, and we assume all who trace their lineage back to Magnus, would suffer from? Perhaps, however, the rubric of Ahriman, the spell that supposedly failed, might not have failed after all. It is unlikely that Ahriman, even with Tzeentch's machinations, was completely wrong in his calculations. Instead, it might have stabilised certain 1,000 Sons, particularly those who weren't fully immersed in the warp at the time, meaning some survivors could have escaped both mutation and damnation. Now, of course, that little bit is really just my own, dare I say it, fan theory. Alternatively, the Flesh Change only really returned for the 1,000 Sons once they had been transported to the planet of the Sorcerers. Yes, a few of them did succumb to the Flesh Change during the burning of Prospero, but they were pushing their psychic powers to their absolute limits, fending off the Wolves and the Sisters of Silence. So it is possible that with the Blood Ravens' more restrained loyalist librarian doctrines, they don't trigger the Flesh Change like the 1,000 Sons did, and as far as they're aware, they're completely unaffected by it. Multiple theories, none of them out of the realm of possibility, but any of them opens the door for a linkage between the Blood Ravens, Thousand Sons, and explains away the flesh change. Next up, we have A Thousand Sons, a novel by Graham McNeill, a story about the Thousand Sons pre-heresy and their lead up to the burning of Prospero. In the novel, Psyker and Remembrancer Callista Eris experiences a haunting vision before the burning of Prospero. Throughout the novel, she is plagued by experiences that border on possession, waking to find that she has no memory of what happened, but discovering frantic scribbles of seemingly meaningless foresight. In the build-up to the burning of Prospero, Callista experiences another vision, one that hospitalizes her. Unfortunately for Callista, she is not given the time to recover. Ahriman, like the rest of the Thousand Sons, come to realise they have been blinded to the warp and its currents. Unknowingly at the time, this was due to Magnus the Red's efforts to prevent his sons knowing that the Wolves' sights were set on their homeworld. Once Ahriman discovered that there was a soul left on Prospero, still receiving visions of the future, he forced one more out of Callista. This ultimately cost her her life, and it was the first real example of Ahriman doing whatever is needed to reach his goals. But before passing into death's embrace, Callista uttered the following: "The ravens, I see them too, the lost sons and a raven of blood. They cry out for salvation and knowledge, but it is denied." It reads like symbolism with a hint of foreshadowing, and while this vision wasn't helpful to the defence of Prospero, it's something that cannot be ignored when discussing the origins of the Blood Ravens. Of course, not all elements of the Thousand Sons were present on Prospero during its destruction. Crucially, before the arrival of the Space Wolves, Magnus the Red scattered elements of his fleet in orbit. This act alone creates a narrative space for isolated splinter forces, detachments cut off from the Legion's fate. When Magnus ultimately transported the surviving Thousand Sons to the planet of the Sorcerers, not every warrior was accounted for. Elements stranded off-world or unable to reach the Great Pyramid of Photep would have been left behind. While many of these detachments later returned to the bulk of the Thousand Sons' force, many remained unaccounted for, their fate uncertain. It is plausible that some of these survivors, untouched by overt Chaos corruption and still loyal to the Emperor, chose concealment over damnation. Over the long millennia that followed, such a group could have re-emerged beneath altered heraldry, their origins obscured by necessity. Within the Imperium's long and often deliberately opaque history of foundings, a successor chapter arising from such hidden stock is far from impossible. Yet this theory raises a compelling question: why would survivors of Prospero willingly realign with the Imperium after what could only be perceived as betrayal? As previously mentioned, the fifth fellowship of the Thousand Sons is particularly interesting, as we actually have an example of Thousand Sons staying loyal to the Imperium after the burning of Prospero. One documented example of this strengthens the argument that not all Thousand Sons fell to chaos. The fifth fellowship, failing to reach the Pyramid of Photep and therefore excluded from Magnus's mass teleportation, reportedly sheltered within the ruins of Tizca. Concealed beneath psychic kind shields, they stayed hidden from the Wolves and the Sisters searching for any survivors. From there, they are said to have secured Imperial Army transport vessels and escaped the encircling Space Wolves fleet. Rather than descending into rebellion, this group re-entered Imperial oversight. Placed under the supervision of the Sisters of Silence, they were re-equipped from Terran reserves, and reverted their iconography to pre-Magnus heraldry, effectively distancing themselves from their Primarch's increasingly suspect legacy. In subsequent campaigns, the Fifth Fellowship fought alongside the Imperial Fists against the Wordbearers. Suffering heavy losses, they eventually proved their loyalty to the Imperial Fists, and they are absorbed into the Imperial Fists' ranks. This establishes a crucial precedent. Thousand Sons could remain loyal, they could fight for the Imperium, and they could be reintegrated. And when you consider the Fifth Fellowship's armour, dark red and black, with a white helmet, it's not that dissimilar from the Blood Raven veteran. At the end of the day, the Fifth Fellowship might not be unique. There could be multiple groups, multiple survivors, multiple hidden legacies, and if that's the case, the Blood Ravens might just be the most visible example. So that's the evidence. Some of it subtle, some of it a bit harder to ignore, but of course this isn't the only theory out there. So next, we'll take a look at the competing explanations behind the Blood Raven's origins and whether they hold up. And while many people tend to agree that the Blood Ravens are a successor chapter of the Thousand Sons, the only other theory that crops up with any degree of frequency is that they are a successor of the Word Bearers instead. At first glance, there is a connection. Both the Blood Ravens and the Word Bearers are linked to the world of Cyrene. Cyrene was once a major recruiting world for the Word Bearers, known for producing populations steeped in faith, devotion, and religious fervour. And at various points in the lore, it is implied that the Blood Ravens have also recruited from this same world. Of course, the Blood Ravens, desperate for recruits and low on numbers, recruit from multiple different worlds. On paper, it does sound significant, a shared recruitment world, a shared history, but when you take a step back, it does start to lose some weight. The Imperium is vast. Over the course of 10,000 years, recruitment worlds are reassigned, rediscovered, and reused constantly. A single planet being tied to multiple legions or chapters isn't unusual, it's expected. So while Cyrene is an interesting overlap, it's not a unique one. In fact, taken in isolation, it's no more compelling than saying they both wear red power armour. It's a detail, it's not evidence. Supporters of the Word Bearers theory often point to thematic similarities. Both forces are tied to ideas of belief, truth and hidden knowledge. Both have an air of secrecy around them, but here's the problem. Those themes are everywhere in Warhammer 40,000. You can find them in the Inquisition, the Dark Angels, half the Imperium if you look hard enough. They're not specific enough to establish a meaningful link, and that's where the theory falls apart for me. When you compare the Word Bearers theory directly to the Thousand Sons theory, it starts to struggle. The parallels with the Thousand Sons are not just thematic, they're specific. An unusually high number of psychers, direct references from Ahzek Ahriman, Corvidae Raven symbolism, possible traces of the flesh change, and prophetic imagery of ravens of blood. These aren't broad ideas, they're precise, repeated, and at times deliberate across multiple sources and different novels. By comparison, the Word Bearers theory rests almost entirely on a shared recruitment world. That's a much weaker foundation. The Word Bearers theory isn't completely baseless, it highlights an interesting connection and it's worth acknowledging, but ultimately it doesn't hold up after scrutiny. Cyrene is a coincidence, not a smoking gun, and when you place it alongside the far more detailed, consistent and frankly suspicious links to the Thousand Sons, it becomes very difficult to argue that the Blood Ravens' origins lie elsewhere. There is one other theory that occasionally gets mentioned, albeit far less frequently, the idea that the Blood Ravens are a successor of the Blood Angels, and to be blunt, this one doesn't really have much to stand on at all. The connection seems to rest almost entirely on the shared word blood in their names.
Really?
And that's it. No meaningful overlap in doctrine, no shared symbolism beyond colour, and no narrative hints tying them together in any significant way. If anything, the two chapters are very different in identity. The Blood Angels are defined by their genetic curse, the Red Thirst, and more famously the Black Rage. The Blood Ravens, on the other hand, show no sign of either. Now, if this theory were somehow true, it would raise a very interesting implication, that the Blood Ravens have completely mastered or entirely eliminated the Black Rage, which would be an extraordinary achievement, and one that would almost certainly be referenced somewhere in the lore, but it isn't, and that silence speaks volumes. So where does that leave us? We've looked at the trivial details, we've gone through the more compelling evidence, and we've addressed some of the competing theories. At the end of the day, I've laid out the information that currently exists within the lore, and while Games Workshop is incredibly unlikely to ever give us a definitive answer, because mystery is a core part of Warhammer 40,000, that doesn't mean we're left with nothing. In fact, what we do have is about as close to a conclusion as this setting ever allows. 40k thrives on ambiguity, on half-truths, on lost records and buried histories, and that's part of what makes it so engaging. It gives you the space to build your own interpretations, your own narratives, even your own armies. But based on everything we've gone through today, the idea that the Blood Ravens are descended from the Thousand Sons isn't just speculation anymore. It's a theory built on a foundation that's very hard to ignore. If you've got your own take on this, whether you agree, disagree, or think there's something I've missed, drop it in the comments below. I'd genuinely like to hear it. And if you've made it this far, thanks for sticking with me through something a bit different. If you like this video and the slight tangent this channel has pivoted to, albeit for one video at the moment, drop it a like and let me know you'll be open to more 40k lore videos in the future. Thanks for watching, and my usual programming of painting tips will return shortly. And if you think I've mispronounced any of the names within the lore of 40k today, that's because words are hard. I'll see you in the next one.